Welcome to Question Period on this Sunday, November 30th. I'm Vassy Kapelos. Today, Memorandum of Division.
It's a great day for Alberta. It's a great day for Canada.
Ottawa and Alberta's historic energy deal lays the groundwork for a new oil pipeline. But while the Prime Minister and the Alberta Premier appear delighted, others are most certainly not.
No proponent, no route, no money, no First Nation support.
BC Premier David Eby and coastal First Nations remain vehemently opposed, and one of Mark Carney's own ministers, Stephen Guilbeault, resigned from cabinet in protest. Is the Prime Minister offside with his own MPs? I'll ask Federal Environment Minister Julie Dabrusin. Then I'll ask Premier David Eby how far he's willing to go in his opposition to a new pipeline. Plus, the Sunday strategy session will tackle the political risks for all parties involved, and the former CEO of pipeline company Kinder Morgan offers his perspective on next steps. We'll start today with the historic energy agreement signed this week by the federal government and Alberta. Prime Minister Mark Carney and Alberta's Premier Danielle Smith committed to a series of measures aimed at strengthening cooperation on major projects, namely, quote, the construction of one or more private sector constructed and financed pipelines with Indigenous peoples co-ownership and economic benefits, with a route that increases export access to Asian markets as a priority. The MOU also states Canada and Alberta remain committed to achieving net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. That climate target provision wasn't good enough, though, for Mark Carney's Minister of Canadian Identity. Lifelong environmentalist Stephen Guilbeault resigned from cabinet, citing his strong opposition to the Memorandum of Understanding and writing, quote, over the past few months, several elements of the climate action plan I worked on as Minister of the Environment have been or are about to be dismantled. For more on all of that, the MOU and the response from the former Environment Minister, I'm joined by current Environment Minister Julie Dabrusin. Minister, a pleasure to see you. Thank you so much for making the time.
Thank you so much for having me.
I did want to start off with former Minister Guilbeault's comments, your predecessor. In his resignation letter, he noted that, and I'm going to quote here, a pipeline to the West Coast would have major environmental impacts and move Canada away from its greenhouse gas emissions targets. Do you agree?
When I look at this agreement as a whole, what I see is that we actually have an agreement with the province of Alberta in a way that we haven't had before, a cooperation that we have not had before, to actually commit to environmental policies like the industrial carbon price and strengthening it, which has been a real point of contention, and also to work towards the clean electricity regulation and having an agreement with a pathway to getting to net zero by 2050 on their electrical grid. So when I look at the MOU as a whole, I think it's a really important step forward in creating a more collaborative way on environmental policy.
But on the aspects of, for example, what you just highlighted, yes, there is broad agreement, I would say, in principle on what you put out, but the specifics of it are not exactly as you present. And I'll take the carbon price first. So I interviewed Minister Smith. I asked her repeatedly, if a bitumen pipeline, a new one, doesn't go ahead, are you still committed to raising the industrial price of carbon? And she would not say unequivocally yes. And she pointed to the language in the MOU, which stipulates a negotiation. It's an agreement to have an agreement by next April. So if you're saying this is, a good thing for climate, how can you say that given the lack of commitment on her end on that part? And that's a key part of any climate plan.
Oh, the industrial carbon price is really important. That's part of the reason why I am so supportive and really believe that this MOU is important. Because right now, the credit price in Alberta for the industrial carbon price is trading at about $20 to $25. It's very low. It's too low to actually be effective. And in the agreement, we see a credit price of $130. That's actually, a bit more than 6 times what it's currently trading at. And that's the kind of thing that we need to see to be able to move forward. And it's absolutely correct. I have until April 1st as our government to sit down with the province of Alberta on how we move forward on even more of the work that we need to do on a strengthened industrial carbon price. But we're talking and we're actually doing that work, which frankly, before this MOU, we weren't. So this is a step forward.
Sorry, pardon the interruption. The difference is that the previous government, yes, they didn't have total buy-in from Alberta, but they were willing to say, look, reaching our climate objectives, the targets we've set out, is so important that if they don't cooperate, we're going to impose it. What you've done through this is water down the methane regulations for Alberta. You've exempted them from the targets that were supposed to be in place for 2035 for clean electricity. And yes, the industrial price on carbon, there's a commitment to negotiate on that. But as I told you, the Premier is not unequivocal about hiking that price, which again is so key to displacing all the other stuff that you guys have rolled back. So I don't understand how this strengthens your government's position on climate, with all due respect, Minister.
Yeah. So why don't I go to the electricity piece specifically? Because I think that there's a piece there that I would really like to clarify. And that is that on the clean electricity regulations right now, province of Alberta to date hasn't been supportive of the clean electricity regulations. But the way that the regulations work, they only start applying starting in 2035. There's a bit of a runway for provinces to set up and get ready to meet the requirements for the regulation. And any province has the ability to negotiate if they have a different pathway to be able to meet the regulation requirements. As long as they can meet the same objectives, they can show a different path that's better for their region. There's a space for us to do what's called equivalency agreements.
But actually, I have interviewed your predecessor on numerous occasions on this, and Premier Smith, and what she kept saying was, we can do what they want by 2050, but we can't do all the other stuff they want us to do. And your predecessor would say, well, that's not good enough. We still think that that's important because we've set out specific targets, and being able to do that is going to help us get to those targets. This is not saying the same thing. You're essentially saying to Danielle, you're conceding to Danielle Smith that the position she has held for as long as she has is one that you now acquiesce to.
No, I actually fully disagree with that because, like I said, under the clean electricity regulations, any province can come forward and negotiate with us to show us that they will meet the same objectives as the regulations, but just that they have a different pathway to do it. We do that with industrial carbon pricing, for example. We do that with methane regulations already with different provinces. So this is just a way that we finally have Alberta saying, yes, we'll sit down and we'll talk with you about how we can set out the pathway. And in the memorandum of understanding, it's really clear that we both have to agree that that pathway meets the objectives of the regulation. So I think it's important. They were fighting us on clean electricity regulations, and now they're saying that they'll sit down at the table with us and they'll start talking about how we can negotiate a path forward. So that's important. It's not backing away at all.
So why then is that viewpoint not substantiated by any independent organization assessing your government's climate plan or lack thereof? I'll point to, for example, a statement from the Canadian Climate Institute, which I've heard members of your government reference on multiple occasions through the past number of years. At a time when Canadian climate change policy needed increased certainty, today's MOU does the opposite. Carve-outs for Alberta invite copycat demands from other provinces and territories and could trigger more policy fragmentation across Canada. The Canadian Climate Institute assesses actually that your government is now nowhere near the targets you had set in place by 2030. Will you concede to Canadians watching now that your government will not meet those targets?
No, what I was saying, I've said it before, and I'll say it again. And Prime Minister actually said it in the House of Commons as well. We're determined to meet our objectives, our climate targets. The thing is, we also always knew that they were really, really ambitious targets. And we could have set lower targets. They'd be easier to meet. We knew that these would be tougher targets to make. But we have to do that work. And having agreements with provinces, because we could never do it as a federal government alone. There was never a way that we would be able to meet all these targets alone. We need the provinces to also help us to get there. And what we have with this agreement, but also other agreements where we're working with provinces, is how we can actually move forward and actually step up to meet those targets. So it's a stretch. It's hard. I'm not telling you that it's easy, but we have to keep working towards them and we have to keep stretching.
I guess I don't remember when your government legislated these targets, anywhere in the legislation or your communications to Canadians at the time, anyone saying, well, this is going to be a big stretch, we probably won't make it. And I think it's incumbent on me on behalf of Canadians who care a lot about climate to ask the how, right? I mean, what former Minister Guilbeault pointed to in his letter, what I read in the introduction, was the rollback of so many key policy planks. A pause for the EV mandate, for the EV mandate, rollback of the consumer carbon tax, emissions cap, which last year in April you were defending in the House of Commons, clean electricity rules, framework to end fossil fuel subsidies. All of that is what he pointed to as being rolled back. I don't understand, like from a mathematical perspective, given how much each of those policies were to contribute to the reductions by 2030, how you can achieve those targets. Why do you continue to tell Canadians that you can when there is no evidence that that is the case?
So two things. Like, I deeply care about the environment and climate change too, and you know, as you know, I'm a mother of 2 young women. Like, I think it's really important for all of our future generations that we get this right and that we fight climate change as a country. So I absolutely, you know, remain committed to doing that. And as I've said before, like, it's it's always been ambitious. I think that we actually always knew it was ambitious, and I believe that we've said that before. But beyond that point, you know, we have a climate competitiveness strategy that actually sets out that we're going to strengthen the industrial carbon price right across the country. We are strengthening methane regulations. We're actually going beyond it and applying methane regulations to landfills. We're investing in clean electricity through clean electricity ITCs. And we're also, through major projects, putting in pieces like with the Iqaluit hydro project that's going to get Iqaluit off of diesel and move them to clean electricity, the Northwest corridors, and also another electricity piece, the high-speed rail, which, you know, as someone who lives in Toronto, it's really exciting to be able to see a way that we can get from Toronto to Quebec City in a way that's more comfortable, faster, and I would say also reduces emissions.
But much of what you just described, Minister, is not something that's going to happen by 2030. And in no way do I doubt your personal, commitment to the issue. This isn't meant to be personal at all. But I look at the analysis from the Canadian Climate Institute once again, where it pieced apart the policies by percentage of how much each would lead to reducing emissions by the targets that you set out, ambitious or not, they're in the legislation by 2030. And when you subtract the emissions cap, you're subtracting about 30% of what was going to get us there. When you subtract the fuel charge, you're subtracting about 8 or 9%. So how are you going to displace all of that? Because all your government keeps doing right now, including through this MOU, is rolling back a whole lot of stuff.
So I'll disagree with the characterization that we're rolling things back when we've actually committed to strengthening the industrial carbon price, strengthening methane regulations, extending the methane regulations to landfills, and also to building out infrastructure that in the long term does help us to move towards a cleaner electricity
but you've
grid.
Taken away the emissions cap. I'm sorry, you've taken away the emissions cap.
Oh, yeah.
You've taken away the consumer carbon tax. If a conservative prime minister did that, your party would call them a climate change denier.
So on the emissions cap, we actually relied on expert advice, and in the budget it was pretty clear how it was set out, that if we did the steps of strengthening the industrial carbon price, strengthening methane regulations, that there were measures in there, that there was a pathway to be able to remove the cap, and that we've had experts actually do that analysis. And so what you see is us continuing to put those building blocks in place with methane regulations, with the industrial carbon price that actually sets that groundwork for us to be able to do it. But in everything that we do, we need to keep moving and pushing forward on reducing emissions and fighting climate change. That commitment is absolutely still there. And it's in two places. One place where it's regulatory, but the other piece is also in actually making sure that we're building that electrical grid for the future that we need.
Okay, I will leave it on that note. I've taken a lot of your time, Minister. I appreciate it very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Coming up, pipeline pushback. Not everyone is on board with a potential pipeline to the BC coast. That province's Premier, David Eby, for example, is vehemently opposed. He will join me next.
The bottom line for us is that we need to make sure that this project doesn't become an energy vampire with all of the variables that have yet to be fulfilled. No proponent, no route, no money, no First Nation support.
Welcome back to Question Period. From Ottawa to Victoria, the energy deal signed between the federal government and Alberta is reverberating across the country. It opens the door to a new oil pipeline to Canada's west coast, but that outcome is far from inevitable. Standing in opposition, the BC government and coastal First Nations. Joining me now is BC Premier David Eby. Hi, Premier Eby. Pleasure to welcome you back to the show. Thanks for making the time.
Thanks for having me.
I was speaking with Minister Hodgson on the show late in the week. He indicated that he was headed to BC to meet with you. I think that meeting has taken place. I'm wondering what you can share about what occurred during your meeting.
Yeah, hot off the press, Vassy. He literally just left the office here. Well, it was a challenging but frank exchange between us. I had to outline again for the minister why it is that British Columbia is concerned about what happened in Alberta in terms of this agreement about the pipeline proposal that Premier Smith is advancing. First of all, let me say, I think it's important that the Prime Minister is able to de-escalate tensions with Alberta. I think it's bad for the country when we're not all able to sit down and solve problems together. And that's why I think it was important that British Columbia should have been at the table too. We have some really big projects in BC. We are leading the country, major private sector projects. We have 4 times more projects than any other province in Canada. The reason we have those projects, why we're able to fast track and work on them, is because we have the support, or at least the tolerance, of coastal First Nations. And they understandably view the proposal of a heavy oil pipeline to the north coast of British Columbia as existential. A spill would be the end of way of life there, as well as $1.7 billion in economic activity and thousands of jobs. And so any conversation that is about that part of the world that doesn't include them, that is about heavy oil to the coast, threatens their support for major projects that we're trying to advance here in BC that are going to lift up the Canadian economy, the largest private sector investment in Canadian history. LNG Canada Phase 2 is reaching final investment decision in the next year. They have all their permits. There's a company. They're ready to go. We rely on the tolerance of coastal First Nations to be able to get this project across the finish line.
Have those First Nations, well, I have a 2-part question. First of all, was the minister receptive to that argument? Second of all, have those coastal First Nations been explicit? Because I have heard you say it on multiple occasions, and I have poured through all of their comments. You're right that is existential to them, that they are against the development of any additional bitumen pipeline that would go to that coast. But I have not heard them say, if even discussions occur or the prospect is there, then we won't go forward with anything to do with any LNG project.
No, they've not said that, but they have said very clearly, and they said it as recently as yesterday, that their support for significantly increased marine traffic through the Hecate Strait is dependent on there not being a heavy oil pipeline as part of that package. And they, understandably, feel they have not been part of any conversation with the federal government. They need to be. They need to be front and center. That's why in BC we're able to advance the projects that we're advancing. And these aren't minor projects. These projects total about $90 billion and access the exact markets that are being targeted by the Prime Minister. And unfortunately, Alberta is, even on the most optimistic take, many, many, many years behind us in terms of this proposal. They have no project proponent, they have no money, they have no route, and they certainly don't have First Nation support.
I understand that. I wonder, though, is there a way to mitigate that problem by simply outlining what you just did, which is that now there are conditions in which maybe a private proponent comes forward, but that proponent has not come forward. We don't have any indication that that will be the case. There also isn't even a route specified, right? Like it could go to Kitimat, but it also could go to Vancouver. Like we don't know for sure. The market will likely dictate that, and then the federal government will have to decide whether to approve it. Like, is there not a way to mitigate the concerns you have instead of kind of presenting an immovable position? Yeah,
well, I think it's important to maybe make the position of British Columbia clear here. The coastal First Nations are the ones that need to be at the table on this issue. Their concerns need to be addressed and they need to be heard. And since the late 70s that they've taken this position, and politicians of every stripe for generations have understood it, been clear about the fact that there shouldn't be oil tankers in this area because of the nature of the water and the dangers. Like we just had a big container barge just about go down. We had a big diesel spill with the Nathan Stewart that contaminated a huge area. Like these are rough waters. And that's why it's been supported by politicians over many generations. So if in fact the plan is to leave the oil tanker ban in place and not to go to the North Coast, then they're the first group that should be told that. And I would welcome that because it would make it so much easier for us to have the hard conversations we have to have about the projects that actually do exist, that are going to employ a lot of people and bring a lot of money into this country.
Is your position, Premier, that you have expressed prior to the actual formal MOU being released that you don't want to see additional bitumen pipeline? Like, is that contingent on it going to an area where the coastal First Nations have expressed the position that they have? Or are you just writ large against it happening at all, even if it went somewhere else?
I think it's a grave mistake to get rid of the oil tanker ban off the north coast of British Columbia. I think that the risk of an oil spill is really significant in terms of the economic harm. Every Canadian that enjoys seafood across the country, a good chunk of it comes from these waters. There are thousands of fishing jobs. There's huge tourism jobs, and it is a big deal. But we've tried to put forward other proposals. You know, there is a publicly owned pipeline. This is not the first time Alberta has had this discussion with Ottawa. Prime Minister Trudeau built a publicly owned pipeline. It cost $30 billion. It's operating right now. I can almost see it from where I'm sitting, actually. And it's not operating at capacity. It can be optimized further to add significant additional capacity. We've offered that up to Alberta to say, hey, we're happy to work with you on this. And I say happy, but it's gritted teeth. We fought that pipeline pretty hard for similar concerns. But it's built now. It's publicly owned. It is a moment for Canada. We're willing to sit at the table and work out those details and get it done. And so trying to find a path forward, trying to de-escalate tensions with our neighbors, trying to understand their concerns, what they would like to do. And I really hope they do the same for us. We are trying to deliver some really big projects here in BC. We have the permits, the companies. We've been doing work for years with the First Nations. They're just starting in Alberta. Don't screw up our stuff because it is meaningful for the whole country. It means jobs for families. It means tax revenues for Ottawa to pay for public services, and that it doesn't feel like too much to ask.
Beyond, though, the optimization of TMX, I take your point on that. I take your point on the tanker ban. If you know there is the possibility of additional export capacity beyond that does not impact the tanker ban, are you inherently against that? Is my question.
No, I think we can have those conversations. My anxiety is about this oil tanker ban, which is the foundational social license piece for tens of billions of dollars of investment in BC that is nearing final investment decision, and tens of billions of dollars of investment that is medium term as well, like expansion of the Port of Prince Rupert and so on. And so if we can agree that the oil tanker ban is going to stay in place, then let's have those conversations. I think that would make life a lot better and easier in British Columbia in terms of our relationship with coastal First Nations. And we definitely take down the temperature and maybe enable some creative solutions. I'd love to talk about refining. We're buying oil and gas from the United States right now. Let's refine some of that Alberta bitumen and use it in cars in British Columbia. Lots of people still driving gas cars, myself included. And why don't we do projects that add value to Canadian resources and get a net win for everybody out of that?
You sound, I hope you don't mind me saying, you sound less angry than you did the previous few times that we spoke about this prior to the MOU. Is there a reason for that?
Well, you know, look, if the federal government is going to impose this on British Columbia, they're going to impose it on British Columbia. We've been down that road. I don't think it's beneficial to be fighting. The piece that does, Vassy, if you're looking for Premier Eby agitated,
I'm not looking for it. I'm just curious. I promise.
Well, no, of course not. But the Nutrien decision gets me agitated because instead of Premier Scott Moe calling me up, engaging with me about this huge billion-dollar decision about whether to ship potash out of British Columbia or out of Washington State. He was engaging with Danielle Smith on this non-existent pipeline project. I didn't hear from the federal government about the Nutrien decision. I had no idea that there was even a prospect that this company would consider putting themselves in the hands of Donald Trump to have tariffs or ban of potash being shipped out of Washington State. And they made the decision, apparently, to ship out of Washington State instead of out of British Columbia. We should have been talking about their concerns about clogged up rail lines and access to the port. We should have been front of the line advocating with Saskatchewan, with the federal government for resources around rail to deal with that. But instead, it was a huge amount of energy went into this non-existent pipeline project. And my worry is we're taking our eyes off the prize.
Okay, I will leave it on that note. Premier, thank you so much. Appreciate your time as always.
You bet, Vassy. Good to see you.
When we come back, the politics of the pipeline. The MOU between the feds and Alberta brings Premier Danielle Smith alongside the Prime Minister, but complicates, as you just heard, Ottawa's relationship with BC and costs the Prime Minister a cabinet minister. The Sunday strategy session with Kathleen Monk, Kory Teneycke, and Scott Reid will be here to talk about all of that.
I understand the need for the Prime Minister to engage with premiers, to reach agreements with them, and I don't fault him for engaging with Alberta on this. It would have been good for BC to be at the table, there's no question about it.
The federal government is building bridges with Alberta, but in doing so, new divides are emerging. BC Premier David Eby is against a potential new pipeline to the northwest coast, warning of the risks of lifting the tanker ban and saying a new pipeline could distract the federal government from other projects. The Fed's MOU with Alberta has also cost the Prime Minister, a longtime member of Cabinet, Canadian Identity and Culture Minister, and former Trudeau-era Environment Minister Steven Guilbeault resigned Thursday over the issue. Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre, meanwhile, says the process still isn't moving fast enough.
Today's deal allows a proposal for a pipeline to go to an office in 7 months, which will then be studied for 2 years, after which the Prime Minister will give a pipeline veto to the BC NDP Premier, who's already said he's against. Isn't this pipeline going to be built in the year never?
Our Sunday strategy session is here to unpack all of that. Kathleen Monk is a former NDP strategist and director of communications to the late Jack Layton. Kory Teneycke was Ontario Premier Doug Ford's campaign manager and former director of communications for Prime Minister Stephen Harper. And Scott Reid is a CTV News political analyst, as well as former communications director to Prime Minister Paul Martin. Hi, everybody.
Hey there.
Scott, I'll start with you on the point of Guilbeault. How big of a deal politically is it?
It's significant in Quebec, and it's easy for those of us in English Canada to overlook the significance. First of all, losing your Quebec lieutenant. You know, I've served for a Liberal Prime Minister. Quebec lieutenant's a powerful position. You're a field marshal. That's really important for a Prime Minister who, let's face it, culturally, linguistically, he's not in the natural flow of Quebec. He's not from Quebec. And so he's winning seats in spite of himself. That's going to be a little harder now without that Quebec lieutenant. But overall, in some ways, if you wanted to really try to spin this thing as hard as possible, the Liberals could make the argument this just demonstrates the depths of the Prime Minister's commitment to focus on jobs, growth, and building, even if it comes at the expense of opposition in British Columbia, the expense of opposition among concentrated groups and communities like BC Coastal Chiefs, and even if it comes at losing a cabinet minister. It just shows to Goya that the Prime Minister is determined to focus on jobs, focus on growth, focus on creating independent choices, independent of the United States and Donald Trump's whims and weapons.
Kory, I know you personally are probably the most devastated to see Mr. Guilbeault exit cabinet.
Let's have a moment of silence.
Yeah, a moment of silence for Kory.
I cried myself to sleep last night over this.
I figured that you did. Your thoughts on what it means?
Well, I think it's good news for the Liberals in the longer term. I hear what Scott's saying, and I don't want to diminish that. You know, Guilbeault does have a following in Quebec. But there's another way of looking at this. You know, I've always been fond of the Lincoln quote that a house divided against itself cannot stand. And there's an element of that in this Carney government. Like there are people in it, Wilkinson, Guilbeault, others, who are very much Trudeau-era ministers. They were emblematic of that Trudeau era. Lots of virtue signaling, a very heavy focus on climate change policy, almost to the exclusion of economic policy. And Carney's the opposite. And his cabinet has been very focused on major projects and resource projects and mining projects, pipelines, on and on. It's very difficult to reconcile those two very different perspectives in the same cabinet. And so I think one of them had to go. And as a conservative, I'm glad it was Guilbeault that left, not the other.
To Kory's point, though, it's not just Steven Guilbeault. He definitely is perhaps the most emblematic of, in particular, the climate position of the previous government. But there are other people who sit around the cabinet table and in that caucus who not only value climate policy and reducing emissions, but also, I think, thought that the Prime Minister would be as focused on that, or at least,
He wrote a whole
put
book
put
on
a
it.
primacy on
Yeah.
it, given his history. Do you think that matters politically to him?
I think it matters hugely. I think it's consequential because remember, Carney has that huge base in Quebec of 44 seats. He has another huge base of 20 seats in BC, and he's gambling a lot of that on Alberta, which in the best case scenarios, Liberals, I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, Scott, have only ever won 4 seats at the top in Alberta, whether it was 1968 or 2015. So it's really a question of like, what is the calculus here? And it's not just Guilbeault as the former environment minister who ushered in a lot of these policies that now Carney is sweeping aside, whether it's, the methane gas, whether it's the clean electricity or the carbon cap. It's really all of the environmentalists and people who believe in the green transition that actually will back away from Carney and actually probably criticize him that he's actually embracing an older view. In light of the Trump's threat against our economy, Carney is in some way doubling down on Trump's thesis that we have to go back to some kind of weird golden age that no longer exists, where we chop, wood and we dig for rocks, and that's all we do. There's no value added ideas in this particular MOU in terms of the idea of the pipeline, which was a lot of political theater and great political stagecraft, I might say. Lots of bells and whistles. In fact, I would argue that this MOU was better rolled out than even the federal budget was in terms of the discussion and the political stagecraft, as I say. And I think that the after effects, frankly, of Guilbeault's resignation will be felt. I spoke to a lot of environmentalists over the last few days, and they are fuming.
So it poses an interesting kind of question, Scott, which we talked about as this was unfolding live, which is, it is hard to see from a sheer political perspective what the win is, given the amount of support the Liberals have in BC, given the amount of support that they rely on in Quebec, and the lack of it in Alberta. Is it fair to conclude that that wasn't what underpinned the decision?
It absolutely is fair to conclude that, because sure as shooting, nobody in the Prime Minister's entourage thinks that he can trade seats in British Columbia and Quebec for new won seats in Alberta. That's not going to happen. No one thinks that's going to happen. But look, the politics here is the policy. And you got to remember, yes, there are going to be critics and there are going to be criticisms. I think one of the important things for the Prime Minister in these next days and weeks as he really intends to sell this story, keep it big. The big thing here is your big message. And the big message is we are going to have to pursue, and we promised as a government, he promised to pursue these large projects that could create choices that we can make independently to tap markets in Asia, whether it's LNG or bitumen, to build things like Ring of Fire. We have to do these things to give ourselves choices economically that are independent of a United States that is now no longer a reliable partner. If you keep it on that track, you go over the head of this Quebec versus Alberta, Alberta versus BC, emissions versus non-emissions. You get over the head of that argument and you talk about where 70% of the Canadian public is, which is worried about their jobs, worried about their prosperity, and worried about what lies ahead for their kids in a world where the United States is no longer surely there for us.
So I have a question out of that I want to ask in different ways to both you, Kory, and you, Kathleen, and that is, I understand that thesis, and I certainly, I listen to the way the Prime Minister and his delegates, his ministers describe it, and I think of many Conservative campaigns that have been run over the last number of years, right, where the cleanest LNG, the cleanest oil, we got to get it to new markets, and it's essentially adopting the same language. I wonder where this leaves, I'll ask Kory, where it leaves the Conservatives and where it leaves the NDP to Kathleen. Kory, you first.
I think in an uncomfortable position because, once again, you're seeing Carney basically tear a page out of the Conservative platform, his traditional Conservative platform, and execute it. So, I think you've seen the Conservative line of attack, which is to say, well, we don't disagree with any of this, but you're not doing it fast enough, and will it happen, and are you really going to do it? But that's kind of a weak sauce argument. Compared to the kinds of arguments that the Conservatives could level against Trudeau, because the opposition was drew such a stark contrast to what their focus was. So I think it's uncomfortable for the Conservatives because I think they mostly like what Carney is doing in this respect. So it's harder to criticize somebody when you mostly agree with what they're doing.
Do you think just a quick follow-up, do you, like, if you were to paint a line of contrast, if as they will keep attempting to, what would it be?
I think it's got to be on execution. I think you've got to play for time on this and be critical if it's not happening fast enough. I think that's probably as good as you can get. I think there is an argument to say, like, look, the person who came up with the plan and is being committed to a plan for a long period of time is probably going to be better at executing that plan than somebody who just picked it up yesterday. I think that's kind of the best argument that you can have, but it's hard to make that argument as convincingly if you have Danielle Smith praising the Prime Minister.
That's right.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
very much.
I guess I would add that if the Carney kind of adoption of the Conservative agenda now makes the Conservatives irrelevant, it actually may make New Democrats more relevant. So we all agree that New Democrats in the last election suffered a brutal blow, but this opens up some space for them. And it almost seems the MOU and the rollout yesterday and the rollback of certain policies was almost tailor-made for an Avi Lewis NDP leadership campaign or potentially a draft Guilbeault, bring them on over.
They already rejected.
Campaign.
They said no way.
Yeah. But so if you think of that, this opens up a space for those people who want to see the green climate transition, want to see new energy, an investment in clean electricity, all those things that Carney's saying he'll put on the line, and also are cognizant of the fact that David Eby has done the hard work. This is one fictional project of the pipeline versus 10 real projects that are moving ahead. And if we want those to move ahead, and that New Democratic government is leading those in BC, you could see a coalition of New Democrats gaining strength and taking back some of those BC seats that the Liberals won in the last election.
Big shift. Okay, I'm going to leave it there. Thanks, everyone. Really appreciate it. Our Sunday strategy session. Scott Reid, Kory Teneycke, and Kathleen Monk. When we come back today, lessons learned. The MOU lays out the conditions, as we've been discussing, for a new pipeline, but a lot has to get done before the construction of one can actually get underway. The former president of Kinder Morgan Canada, Ian Anderson, joins me to talk about that after a short break. Welcome back to Question Period and more of our top story. Ottawa and Alberta signed a historic energy deal this week. It lays out conditions under which a new major oil pipeline to Canada's west coast could be built. But while groundwork has been laid, there's a lot that has to be done before shovels can actually go in the ground, including overcoming staunch opposition from BC Premier David Eby and coastal First Nations. Here to walk us through the challenges and opportunities ahead is a man who has spearheaded a major pipeline project to BC's coast, Ian Anderson. He previously served as CEO and president of the Trans Mountain Corporation and president of Kinder Morgan Canada. Hi, Mr. Anderson. It's a pleasure to see you. Thank you for making time for our program.
Yes, thanks for having me.
I wanted to start off on what is emerging when it comes to the feasibility of a potential new pipeline out west as a key question. Will a private proponent come forward? And I wondered, based on your expertise in the area, what you think the main things that will inform that decision are.
Yeah, I think there's two fundamental things. I mean, one is going to be obviously satisfaction that the regulatory risks of proceeding with a project of this sort are manageable and predictable. And from what we've heard from the Prime Minister and the Premier, they're going to make every effort for that to be efficient and timely and predictable. So investors are going to look for that regulatory, kind of a certainty. I think the second thing, and maybe the most important thing in the next step of considering the proposal, is commercial support. The upstream has to commit to move the barrels on the pipeline at some predicted toll based upon a cost estimate. So commercial support and that underpinning is fundamental to undertaking a project of this sort. And I think that's probably the next place that any proponent is going to consider where the barrel's coming from, who's producing them, over what time frame, and looking for that commercial commitment.
And what will go into the decision on, you mentioned some of the factors there, but on commercial support, like what sorts of things will determine that for a company?
Well, they're going to have to look at production profiles and where they think their barrel production is going to come from. I think the steps that are being taken to eliminate any emissions cap, to set a firm, carbon price ceiling, to consider the regulatory efficiencies upstream as well, clarity around methane, clarity around the delivery of pathways and a CCUS solution, all will go to have upstream investors look at what their production is going to be over the coming decade. I think that we're going to see incremental expansions on both Trans Mountain and Enbridge, provide enough capacity for the near term into the next decade. So it's going to take upstream production, commitments in order to line up the commercial commitments they're going to need.
When you referenced off the top there the regulatory environment, I mean, you lived through such a unique thing in Kinder Morgan's decision, right? Because of all of that, to back away from the expansion, you were ultimately the one that pitched then Finance Minister Bill Morneau and the federal government taking it over. Based on, and I understand this is just a first step, but based on the changes that you have seen, do you think it's enough of a change to the regulatory environment to provide a higher level or a necessary level of certainty?
I think there's still work to be done. I mean, what we've heard this week is important. It's maybe historical in what it's accomplished in terms of alignment between the federal government and Alberta, the likes of alignment that we haven't seen in decades. So I think that it is a real solid, great platform. Now the hard work really begins, which is, what does a pipeline route look like? What port destination might we consider? Then who are the impacted communities? So there's lots of groundwork to be done, Vassy, that is the next order of business. Spending some time in British Columbia, as I have over the last 15 years, working on Trans Mountain, local interests matter. So the evolution of the regulatory change, can we possibly get a regulatory decision in 2 years, like the Prime Minister is promising? Mine took, 6 or 7 years. So it will create the necessity for fundamental bureaucratic and regulatory authority shift in order to create the certainty that investors are going to look for. 2 years is very ambitious. The Premier says she's going to file a project plan with the Major Projects Office by July of next year. Well, that can't have done all of the detailed engineering and route assessments and environmental assessments that's going to ultimately be necessary to prove out a project of this sort. So there's lots of work to be done. I think that the signals are extremely positive. I think that the intentions seem to be very genuine and very thoughtful. As we saw, the Pathways pipeline is a prerequisite to an oil pipeline and vice versa. Mm-hmm. So each of those will have their own challenges. I think that we haven't yet seen the regulatory risk evaporate, but it's certainly the intentions of the MOU very strongly pointed in the right direction. The other part of that, of course, is that I believe that the industry itself is going to have to get behind this. We can't just look for Ottawa and Alberta to solve this. We're going to have to lean in as an industry, both upstream and midstream, to demonstrate that we're prepared to do the things necessary to satisfy the tight timelines as well, because industry's wired to do their work over years. And if we're going to be able to comply responsibly with legislation, environmental legislation and the like, we're going to have to do a lot of hard work as industry. And we're going to have to lean in on Indigenous engagement in a very meaningful way.
Just one final question for you, Mr. Anderson, because I've heard you talk about the decision or the push that you made ultimately when Kinder Morgan decided to back away to try and sell that pipeline. You had a belief that there was a real, national case to be made for expanding TMX. Do you feel the same? Like, do you feel that case exists from a security perspective, from a whole bunch of different perspectives? Like, do you think that there is an imperative nationally to get another one built to the West Coast?
I believe there is. But as I said earlier, it's going to take the upstream support and commitment to underpin it. You know, I didn't hear anything from the Prime Minister suggesting that the federal government was prepared to take any financial risks or provide any financial guarantees. Maybe that will come in due course. In fact, you could create an ownership structure that still had the federal government involved in a new pipeline. You could have the provinces involved, you know, economically, and that aligns interests. But I think that is going to take that commercial commitment for us to be able to see the barrels that are going to fill. I think Alberta's got an opportunity to provide some barrels through the royalty in kind program. So I think there's a start there that Alberta can help with. But I can see the need, as I said before. I think Trans Mountain Enbridge can keep the market balanced for, you know, into the next decade. And this pipe is a pipe that we're talking about, you know, in real terms, being required in 5 to 6 years. And I think that that's totally achievable. And, you know, we're going to have to decide, and the market should decide where that pipeline ends up. Like, is it Kitimat? Is it Prince Rupert? Is it Vancouver? Do we go back to Vancouver and build another pipe, you know, along the existing Trans Mountain route, which is always an alternative? So I think that the market has got to now respond. The market's got to respond with its dollars, with its commitment, and with its energy to do their own business a different way if we're going to meet these timelines.
I'll leave it on that note. Thank you for your insights today, Mr. Anderson. Really appreciate it.
You're most welcome. Thank you.
When we come back, the 3 things I'm watching for this week. Stay tuned. Welcome back to Question Period. Here are the 3 things I'm watching for coming up this week. First of all, we'll get some new labor force data toward the end of the week, hot on the heels of new GDP data this week, which showed unexpected growth in the 3rd quarter. We'll also be looking south of the border, where the Prime Minister is headed to Washington for the World Cup draw, and he's expected to meet with U.S. President Donald Trump, the first such meeting in Washington since talks between Canada and the U.S. over trade completely broke off. And speaking of Donald Trump, his special envoy is headed to Moscow to meet with Russian officials this week after a very controversial U.S.-led Russian-Ukraine peace plan. So we'll keep our eyes on that. I'm going to leave Question Period there. I'm Vassy Kapelos. Look forward to seeing you tomorrow on Power Play.